Timmy saying Bawu. So good afternoon, everyone, and it's great to have all of you here today. We have been waiting for this event. It's been ages, and we have been waiting. And we have said seminar series for long, and this is one of the events that we have been waiting for because we have two exciting professors here today. I'll be talking about them in the next couple of minutes. But thanks everyone for being here. This is a research seminar series hosted by the University of Scotland, specifically the School of Business and Creative Industries. And of course, we have our Dean, Professor Dominic Elliott, who unfortunately is not here today because he has another meeting, but he might still be available in the next couple of minutes. My name is Christian Harrison, and I'm a reader in the school as well, and also privileged to facilitate this research seminar series. We've had a great time in the last couple of months, and today we'll be looking at publishing in business and management, the insights from editors. One of the things that we have noticed over time is we tend to have problems with publishing. What are the things that editors are looking for? Why is it that we get our work rejected? What are the things that we need to do? How can we ensure that we publish? Many people will say it's either you publish or what? You perish. So what can we do to ensure that our work remains visible, especially in the next rev cycle? So this is the event that we're talking about this, and it will be a great privilege to get to hear more and get more insights about this from our editors today. The rules of the game, of course, we already know that this is Zoom. And so if you're not talking, please feel free to mute yourself so that you won't have any noise at the background. Most importantly, I always tell people it's not a do or die affair. Hopefully, if there's a fire outbreak, if there's something happening in your house, please leave your computer and go. There is no need to stay to the end. But of course, let's try to engage as freely as possible. And thanks everyone for coming here today. But of course, we didn't come to talk about me, and we don't have so much time. So I'll be introducing the speakers. We have two speakers here today, and in no particular order. The first speaker we have is Professor Stephanie Decker. And Professor Stephanie, let me try to see how I can, yes, I would spotlight Professor Stephanie so you see her. So Professor Stephanie is thanks for being in the spotlight, is the Joint Editor-in-Chief of Business History. She's a Professor of History and Strategy at the University of Bristol School of Management, and also a visiting professor in African Business History at the University of Gothenburg, Sweden. Her work lies at the intersection of organizational studies and historical research, with a focus on the use of historical methodology in organizational research. She has published in many journals, most especially in organizational studies and business history. Has also served as an editorial board member of organization studies, and she's a member of the Council of the British Academy of Management. This is just a synopsis of the big biography of Professor Stephanie Decker, and we have her here today. So Professor Stephanie, we are pleased to have you here today.
Thanks, Christian. Thanks for the invitation.
And the next person, thanks, Stephanie. And the next person is Professor Laura Galloway. So Professor Laura, I've added her now to the spotlight, as the Joint Editor-in-Chief of the International Journal of Entrepreneurship and Innovation. She's a Professor of Business and Enterprise at the Edinburgh Business School, Heriot Watts University, and is also the Director of the EBS Incubator. Professor Galloway's background is in research into entrepreneurship and small business startup and growth. Much of this research focuses on preferentiality, both regionally and demographically, and including examination of minority composition and entrepreneurship-based economic contributions, and the role of entrepreneurship in reducing social and economic barriers for peripheral groups. She has research interests also in the use of impact of ICT in entrepreneurship and entrepreneurship education. So we have an expert in entrepreneurship here and entrepreneurship education, and she has published in a wide range of journals as well. So Thanks, Professor Laura Galloway, and it's a privilege to have you here as well.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so we have the two speakers here today, and we decided to do something creative this time around. You know, in the previous one that we have done, I've had presents a panel session. We have these two renowned professors in the house, so it will be a disservice if we say that you present. Rather, we want them to be able to discuss and try to answer our questions. So please, if you have any questions, this is the time for you to ask them later. So start keeping those questions so that when it's time, you'll be able to ask them questions, because that's why they're here today. So it's going to be in form of a panel, and I'll be chairing the panel, and I'll be asking them questions, and they will be answering these questions. And after the panel, then you will be able to ask them any question. Maybe you've sent an article to Business History and you are rejected. This is the time for you to tell Stephanie, why did you reject me? Or it might be in Laura's journal as well, the International Journal of Entrepreneurship and Innovation. You sent a very nice enterprise article and you got rejected. Why? So this is the time for you to get to know much more about it. And of course, even if you're not in both fields, these are very renowned editors-in-chief. So they will be able to tell you beyond their own expertise what editors look for in the first place. So what we'll be doing right now is we'll be proceeding and I'll be asking them those questions. First, I think I will start with Stephanie. So I'll be asking Stephanie first. I know clearly, Stephanie, you're the editor-in-chief of Business History, and that's a very high-ranking journal based on the CARBS list. How can one publish in Business History? What do you look for? How can I get my paper published in your journal?
Okay, thanks, Christian. So Business History, we recently were ranked 4-star four on the CABS list. We were a 3 for a very long time. And I think that's sort of really important for us as a journal, because even though we're a business history journal, we see ourselves, I would say, as the journal that is interested in the kind of business school literature where it has a relevance to history, and we're a lot more explicit and clear in this than many of our sort of peers in the business history field. The other 4 ranked journal is Business History Review, published by Harvard Business School, but they tend to be quite focused on American business history. It's quite historical. So we are perhaps a journal that takes the most explicit and the most obvious interest in business school research that has an historical angle. But nevertheless, we're still a history journal. So that's very important to us. So we have a sort of a set of peers in a field, and you might say it's quite a small field. We actually have quite a number of journals. Out of those journals, we're probably the ones that publish the most. We have 8 issues a year. We get, from what we hear, by far the highest number of submissions per year. And we obviously, like most journals, get more submissions than what we have space for. So there is a process of filtering and weeding out. And that's sort of perhaps the most important thing to consider for business history or any other journal you want to publish in, is really what processes of quality control, of defining their remit, defining their audience, are these journals engaging in. So for us, that's very clearly that we publish in the domain of business history. We understand that broadly, but there's a limit too broad, and it's interesting. I think for most journals, what you see is that when I talk to editors, everybody gets articles where they feel they're not actually within remit. Now, for us, that works out in a very specific way, and because my fellow editor-in-chief and I, we do a sort of weekly inbox triage exercise. We have lots of opportunity to kind of reaffirm and define how we see the field and what we think is actually within the remit of our journal. And business history, obviously, it needs to be historical. It needs to be about business and organizations. Sometimes we're willing to sort of consider that at the margins if we believe this is something that makes a contribution, is of relevance to issues in the field, even if it might not be particularly a business. It might be a non-profit, it might be an association but has a strong organizational feature, or the debates about how old does it need to be history. We don't take a fixed view on this, and we say if it takes a historical approach, engages with historical debates, It can be relatively recent, but then it needs to be very explicit as to what is historical about this, right? So for us, business history is really about the type of research you do, the subject matter you're looking at, and very importantly, the literature you engage with. So the thing that happens all the time, not just for us, but for any journal, is that we get submissions that do not engage at all with debates in the field. In our case, we don't even mean, do you cite our journal, but do you cite our peers? Do you cite enterprise and society? Do you cite the management organizational history? If you're not citing anything in the business history field and everything is from Academy of Management Review and ASQ and ETP, we're a little bit like, well, why would you be submitting to us? You're not joining a conversation that is taking place in this journal or in journals that operate in the same space as us. And that's often a reason why we say, look, should you really go through a publications process at our journal? That makes no sense. And to be honest, we sometimes wonder why people submit. One of my favorite reasons also to say to somebody, no, sorry, you're getting a rejection, has always been people who think history equates to old data. So I used to have my little standard rejection letter saying, just because it's old data, it's not history. You need to kind of understand what a journal means with its core concept. So Laura will talk about entrepreneurship. There are debates about what is part of entrepreneurship, what is not part of entrepreneurship. Debates are fine, but you need to be clear about why is it within the remit. Recently, we started to really get quite a lot of submissions that are not related at all to our journals. They're systematic literature reviews, something we don't carry at all. We have very few reviews. We have a specific route for reviews to be published in our journal. It is not by submitting a systematic literature review to our main pipeline, yet we keep on getting these. So for us, that's an issue that we don't quite understand why these literature reviews land with us. But for you as authors, I think the key thing is to check, does that journal actually carry that type of article? Now, I do a lot of work with BAM, and at BAM, sometimes people say, so do you take reviews in BJM? And it's like, BJM doesn't take reviews because there's IJMR and they're a review journal. So they have very clear remit in terms of what do they take. Both will take methods. BJM has a methods corner, whereas IJMR now is introducing methods review papers. So they deal with methods in very different ways. So understanding what types of article does a journal actually carry is really important. The other issue tends to be, what is your contribution? So we get excited when we see articles that seem to have a significant contribution to the field. And fields can vary what kind of contributions they favor. So in management business studies, there's a very clear sense of we like theoretical contributions. Obviously, business history is an interdisciplinary journal, and what you find in interdisciplinary journals, there's a wider variety of contributions that are acceptable. So when you look at historical contributions, they're often empirical. It might be new archival data, new knowledge about the past is a definition of a contribution in history, and new knowledge of the past can come from new data, shedding new light on events in the past or things we didn't even know about. Smoking gun in the archive, the document nobody knew about. So these things are still contribution in history. So that is somewhat different from your standard management journal. We also have contributions that are historiographical, reinterpreting what we know about a period, about an event, about a historiographical debate. But we also take theoretical contributions. But theoretical contributions, again, that need to have a historical dimension. So if it's pure theory, it's not that interesting for a history journal because pure theory, by definition, is supposed to be irrelevant to time and place. Now, history is all about the time and the place and what we know about it. So the theory contribution needs to have relevance to history. Otherwise, you're much better off sending this to a journal that is very keen on getting pure theoretical contributions. That's not business history. So these are sort of the criteria that we use to kind of look at journal articles, why we're interested in them. I think it's worthwhile highlighting to you that by now we have a really long pipeline of advanced online published articles, and we've really started to review our internal processes. We have articles that have been advanced online since 2019, so we're going to 18 to 20 months now. So we're getting also a lot more stringent in terms of the articles we believe should actually be put into the publication process. We're using desk reject now a lot more than we did perhaps 3-4 years ago. The thing that's different about business history perhaps than other journals you may be submitting to is we do 2 types of desk reject. So we will sometimes reject a paper a lot for the reasons stated above. It's not within remit. Could also be if we don't believe it's of the quality it needs to be. But what we also do is we offer a reject and resubmit at desk reject stage, which I don't think many journals do. And these are opportunities to give the paper a full rethink. So we may see some real promise in a paper. We often do this with submissions that are in areas that, for example, we don't know very much about. It might be the business history of Thailand, Indonesia. This might be something we've never carried a piece about, might not be very developed. So we may say, look, this needs more work. It's not engaging with the literature, but it's an area of real importance that we know very little about. Or sometimes we just see a piece where we say, well, it's actually really interesting, but it really needs to engage much more with what our audience is familiar with and interested in. So we'll give sort of reject and resubmit decisions to allow people to think again about how to tailor their piece to what is an interdisciplinary journal, because we want to stay open to a broad audience, and we completely understand that we are getting submissions from people who might be in history departments, social science departments, in business schools, that are very international, that may not always be aware of the particular ways in which the different business history journals position themselves. But in order to actually get through, we need that manuscript to engage with these debates. And that's why we offer a sort of reject and resubmit at desk reject stage. I think those are sort of the key issues to consider if you want to publish in business history. And I think in a way we're a flavor on general themes, I would say. Most journals will have processes and considerations around these issues.
Okay, thanks very much, Stephanie, for that, the elaborate introduction about how to publish in business history. And of course, making us know that it's not only about archival data, because a lot of people think, okay, it needs to be something historical. Clearly, from or old data means that's history, but of course, that is not history or business history itself. So now it's time for Professor Laura Galloway as well to tell us, because I know a lot of people here from enterprise and innovation. So now we are privileged to have the editor-in-chief of International Journal of Entrepreneurship and Innovation here. So how can we publish in your journal? What are the kind of things that you think you're looking for?
Well, the first thing is that I would say I would echo a lot of what Stephanie has said. Specifically for the International Journal of Entrepreneurship and Innovation, we publish 3 types of paper. The first is your standard research paper. We also are one of the last journals, I think, that still publish teaching case studies. So we have an aspiration to have 1 included in each edition of the journal. We publish 4 editions a year. Just because I think that there is still, because entrepreneurship is such a dynamic environment, there's still demand for very up-to-date cases that engage with, that act as a link between the research community and the teaching community. You know, we're a big Venn diagram in that respect anyway, but that directly link the research to teaching and teaching practice. So so that's the second type. And for the case studies, it's not a case of here's a case study and a few questions. It's got to link to theory. It's got to have some sort of theoretical underpinning as well. That has to be a contribution to. So that's the second type. The third type of paper that we publish is a new initiative that we've started. It's called, I have to check my acronyms here, Retrospective Research Notes. And they are smaller pieces where we are looking for high quality submissions, but specifically from early career researchers, people who are doctoral, postdoctoral level of their studies. They can submit with a supervisor or with a more established academic, but the main author has to be the early career academic. And again, we have an aspiration to have one of these included in the future going forward per edition. And essentially all that is to create a safe space or a safer space for your early career academics, where they're not pushed out by the more established academics from the get-go. Okay, so it's to give them a space to develop. That said, there's no let up on quality. So we're still expecting quality submissions. They still have to be robust, but they're maybe not as developed as a full research paper would be. Just to give an opportunity and a ring-fenced space for the early career researcher. To go back to the actual question, so how important to be published in the International Journal of Entrepreneurship and Innovation? I think maybe echoing what Stephanie said, first and foremost, read the aims and scope. The aims and scope for, I won't read them all out to you, but for our journal, we look very much at critical perspectives on entrepreneurship. We look at diversity in entrepreneurship, ethics, entrepreneurial behaviour, motivations. We also look at innovation in entrepreneurship, innovative business models, innovation and internationalisation, etc., etc. The thing is that this is all very clearly outlined in the website and in all of the calls for papers, etc., associated with the journal. We are respectful of the review process. And so if you have written a paper that has got something to say, it's an interesting story, it's a contributory story, it makes a theoretical and empirical contribution to the field, then we're going to let the review process take its course. That said, the most common desk rejection letter I write, and when I say most common, several times a week, is that I can't send the paper through the review process because it's not engaging with the aims and the scope in the journal. It's not contributing to any of the conversations in the journal. And that's just literally that the person that's submitting the paper just hasn't checked. And so they've written a paper about something broadly about entrepreneurship, or more commonly, broadly about innovation. So we get quite a lot of submissions about operational processes and things like that, and innovation in the production process and manufacturing. We don't publish papers like that. The operations journals do that. The manufacturing journals do that. It's just that they've read the title of the journal and they thought, oh, I'll punt it there, and it's just not going to go anywhere. I'm not going to be able to send that for review because it's not our remit. That's not in our remit. So that's where you get desk rejected, really, because it's just not making a contribution to the journal. So to answer your question, Christian, how do you get published in the International Journal of Entrepreneurship and Innovation? Well, you read the aims and scope first, and then you write a paper that is contributing to that conversation. So it's a paper that's telling a good story, that's engaging the reader, that's making a contribution either to the empirical or the theoretical field, or both. And that it's a conversation that's playing out in the International Journal of Entrepreneurship and Innovation, and it's sort of broad area of journals, you know, so the International Small Business Journal, Entrepreneurship Theory and Practice, etc., etc. But it's in the right field and it's making a contribution. We're particularly interested in also exploring innovative methodologies, experimentation, the things that business studies is not that terribly good at. So where people have tried new things, we're interested in that. But again, they have to be robust. They have to have some sort of sense of validation to it. Unlike Stephanie's journal, our journal is a 2-star journal. So a lot of the time, I think perhaps people who are submitting think that they can take their eye off the ball in terms of quality. If anything, well, certainly that's not the case, because to be ABS ranked at all means that there's a commitment to a quality process, and the 1-star and the 2-star and the 3-star journals are not a dumping ground for the ones that weren't able to get into the 4s. I think your approach to publishing is find the right paper, find the right journal for your paper, contribute to the conversation in that journal, and write the best paper that you can, with full kind of cognizance of expectations with regard to aims, scope, and quality.
Thanks very much, Laura, for that. I think it's great that I'm happy the way you explained the scope. For many of us here, of course, most people tend to feel okay. They just put in a paper just based on the title. So you see, oh, entrepreneurship and innovation. So anything about innovation, I'm going to put in. But of course, it's so important that we look at the aim and scope of the journal, and that is what you both said. And beyond your two journals, I think it's something that is transferable. So even if you don't want to publish in history or don't want to publish in entrepreneurship and innovation, the first thing you need to do is look at the aim and scope of the journal before you take your paper there. So I think it leads us to me the very next question. That's why most of us are here. What are the do's and don'ts of publishing? What are the things that you need to do in order for you to get published? And what are the don'ts of publishing as an editor-in-chief? And I'll be giving Stephanie, since Stephanie started that question, what are those things that you believe are important for you to get published? And what are those things that you shouldn't do at all if you want to get published?
Yeah, but I mean, I think Laura and I have covered some of the do's and don'ts already. And I think anything to do with what is that journal you're submitting to known for? What are they interested in? That's, I think, a really important point, understanding the remit of a journal. And on the flip side, also understanding what does a journal not take. Those are really key do's and don'ts. And that's why I think, regardless of which journal you're looking at, most journals, if not all journals, will have very clear criteria around that. So it's important to understand those. In terms of the do's and don'ts, I think it always goes back to see the journal not just as a place you need to position your work in. So it's not just about the 4, the 3, the 2, the 1-star journal you're hitting. It's really about the fact that journals represent conversations within the field. They represent communities. And I think for that reason, I'd also like to echo what Laura was saying, which is, the 3s, the 2s, the 1s, they're not just dumping grounds for something you couldn't get in somewhere else. I would say if you have a good 3-star, the difference in review process to a 4-star to me often is extremely fine, I would say. And sometimes as well, I find the 3 stars can maybe trickier or maybe even lead to higher quality at times, simply because they're often journals that represent very specific communities, a very specific approach within the field. Whereas what you see with the 4 stars, they're these broad church journals. So that sometimes perhaps it depends a little bit more who's the specific editor and who are the reviewers. That will just have a bigger influence on how the review process goes. In 3s and 2s, you're very much joining a conversation. It's very much a group of people that push forward specific topics and themes. And that makes it very important that you understand that in order to get into those journals. And I think they're worthwhile. There's very good visibility in those journals because that's really what a community is reading. But all journals, I think we sometimes forget that because it's such a highly pressured publish and perish situation in some universities. They all represent communities. They're all essentially conversations that play out in a very, very long time period, but you always join that conversation. And I think bearing that in mind with everything you do, there are actually people at the end of that system. You might be submitting to Manuscript Central or to the Elsevier system. There are people on the other end who are going to be reading this and are going to be engaging with it. And I think sometimes it feels very automated, but that's really just to support the process. You're still talking to other people, and these other people are colleagues. And almost all of them will do this for free. The reviewers, but also the editors. It's relatively rare that there's really payment for this. So people are really bringing their time to that process. So it's worthwhile for you to kind of think about how are you gaining their attention, and how are you also making clear that you're a serious person who wants to have a say in that community and in that space. And that's really that's what you should bring across in your letter, in your manuscript, in any responses you write in the review process, this understanding you're joining a conversation with your colleagues. It's at one remove, and you might not always know who they are because that's a double-blind peer review process, but it is a conversation. Now, I think the other thing Laura also already commented on is this sort of, where was this paper before? And I think it's become easier and easier with these systems to just kind of hit resubmit. We get a lot of journals where we look at the formatting and we think, you're just coming from Economic History Review, aren't you? And you can just see it, and you see that all of this is clearly the layout of another journal. Now, it might still be a very good paper and I'm still going to read it, but that is my first impression. And I'm not superhuman, I can't take that impression away. Now, our publishers allow something known as format-free submission, so you can submit in any format you want to. My only advice is never do that. If anyone offers this to you, never do that. Even if they don't give you any guidelines on formatting, check how it looks like in the journal. Make it look from the get-go that this is written for them. And if that means it was rejected somewhere else and you need to change it, change it. You don't want to give the impression you were rejected somewhere else. People see it, it sets expectations on a way that has nothing to do with the content and the quality of what you're submitting. And then you're always batting against this impression. And that's not the starting point you want to work from, okay? The other thing I find is journals vary whether editors like to have reviewers suggested. Now, we don't do that at all. And I find in some journals they'll ask for it, and that's fine. I think then you should supply that. I'm personally really wary of suggesting reviewers if it's not asked for. And that might work out well for you, but I think it could also really backfire. Apart from the fact that if you talk to colleagues, a lot of the people who suggest reviewers, they don't realize that these reviewers don't always give them the most favorable reviews. So the most interesting thing you hear from other editors is really that people suggest reviewers who end up possibly canning their paper. So if you are asked to suggest reviewers, think very carefully about who you suggest, because obviously it makes an impression on editors when that happens. So there is a whole etiquette around where that's acceptable and where not, but I would really urge caution. Either don't do it unless asked for, and then think carefully about who you suggest. Don't suggest too many if you're not sure about them. But there is a way in which you can sort of influence that process in a way that is more subtle and maybe a little bit more helpful in terms of you getting your paper through, getting it to the right reviewers, steering the editor in the right space and direction. That's something you absolutely want to do. And that's really to think about who would you like to review that paper, and think about citing them in the first 3 pages, maybe first 5 pages. Editors read that, they'll see who's been cited and think, oh, I might ask that person to review this. It also helps, obviously, if the people who are going to review this read their name early on and know you have engaged with their work if they're an expert in that area, and that is pretty much the only reason why they would, donate that time to actually read it. So think about who are you engaging with in the first 3 to 5 pages, and quite frankly, if they're all retired or no longer with us, you really need to rethink who you're citing, because this will also raise some questions around how recent and how cutting edge is your research. So think very carefully, not just about how you're presenting it, how you're submitting it, what you're saying, and how well structured it is. Look at who are you citing and what sort of signals are you sending with your citations, because again, it is all about joining a conversation, and you're signaling the conversation with your citations. So from my side, I think those are sort of the key tips that I find help steer the process in a direction that will hopefully end up with your piece being published.
Thanks very much, Stephanie. I like the way you said it. So most of the time, even the structure, people just put the same structure and you're able to see the exact journal that is coming from. And of course, we're all human, and that bias is always there. So thanks, at least we've been able to note that. I think, Laura, it's almost the same thing, really. I know with entrepreneurship and innovation as well, what do you look for? I know you said a lot of things initially about the scope, but are there exact things you look for in a paper as an editor-in-chief, beyond even your journal? What are the things you look for in a paper? What do you think makes a paper tick?
I think definitely that it's making a contribution, and I'm kind of labouring this point because we get a lot of papers where they've done quite interesting research, but it's replicated. So all they've done is corroborated stuff we already knew. And interesting as that might be for the author of the paper, it's actually not making a contribution. There's no value add in the field. So for me, what I'm looking for in a paper, or what we, myself and Dima Rifai, my partner editor-in-chief, what we're looking for is that you're either corroborating it in a new way, so you're adding validation to something, so there's a new methodology that you've applied or a new theoretical lens that you've applied, or you have found something that nobody found before. If we kind of refer back, you know, to the natural sciences even, you can't just keep saying, I've invented the wheel over and over and over again. That's not publishable. It's only publishable the first few times. So the other thing in entrepreneurship is that you get a situation, I think this is across business studies, where something is true in Germany. And then somebody does exactly the same research in Australia. And then somebody does exactly the same research in the United Arab Emirates, and somebody does the same research in South Africa. And that, again, that is a contribution. But where it's been done to death, I think that you need to step back and say, is there something else I can add, just rather than replicate the location, you know, the same results, but in a different location? Or is there something different about this location where what we normally find doesn't happen? So I think when you start a paper where you're creating the structure for your paper, or I think really sit down and think, why am I writing this paper? What is it I'm hoping to add to the conversation? So when you approach any paper, and I do use these sorts of mantras myself, is what's this about? Why is it important? And then why is it interesting? And that's essentially then going to give you some sense of, well, what's the contribution? Now, the sooner that you can convey that message in the paper, the sooner your reviewer and your editor can see, oh, I see, right, this is worth having a read of. So I think just that for me is the starting point, that it's an actual genuine value-adding contribution. There's something new here, or it's just not publishable. It's just the same old, same old. The other thing probably worth mentioning again is just to confirm really what Stephanie was saying as well. What we see a lot of, probably because we're a 2-star journal, so people will submit to a 4-star. They'll submit to the Journal of Business Venturing, and they've written the paper for the Journal of Business Venturing, and then it's been desk rejected from the Journal of Business Venturing, and then they've gone down to the International Small Business Journal, where it's been rejected again. And so by the time we get it, okay, it's not been edited, it's not been changed, it's got 50 references to the Journal of Business Venturing and 45 to the International Small Business Journal, and none to anybody else. So you can tell at 1,000 paces that this wasn't written for this journal, and that you're just, there's nothing wrong with taking the criticisms of reviewers from a previous submission and using that to build your paper and redraft your paper and taking those ideas on. But you can't just keep shoving the same paper out, because it's just going to get rejected for the same reasons all the way along the process. But all the way along the process, you're going to get editors that are getting more and more grumpy about the fact that it's clearly was never written for that journal in the first place. So yes, if you get a rejection, take that as a constructive thing. This is part of the process of being an academic. But when you get a rejection, you are given constructive comments from the editor, and often, if it's been for review, also from the reviewers. Use them to redraft. Don't just keep clicking submit with the same old thing.
Thanks very much, Laura, for that. And I think you said it very well. It's so important that you make a contribution, you add to the conversation in the community, because at the end, it's not just writing exactly what people have said. What are you doing that is new, and what are you doing that's original? So I think that is very, very important. I'm mindful of the fact that we don't have so much time. I have so many questions for you. I wish I had the whole day, but of course I don't have the whole day because I know all of you are so busy. So I will give the opportunity to the participants and the attendees, colleagues, to ask questions. I can see that Dahlia has already started asking questions, and thanks Stephanie for providing answers to that. I think Dahlia asked, can I ask if this applies to publishing in special issues? are there any considerations for special issues in journals? And Stephanie said, yes, in principle, but special issues usually have a more limited purview and decisions are made more strategically by the guest editors. So I think that has been answered. But now it's time for you guys to ask questions. Any particular questions you want to ask them, and in anybody you want to ask any questions. So this is the time to ask before I continue with my own questions, because I have so many of them. So this is the time. You can signify by raising up your hands, and you're given the platform to ask your questions. So please don't be shy. You can ask your questions if you have any. So questions. I thought you're going to have so many. There's so many here. So where are the questions? Anybody that wants to ask any question at all before we continue?
Christian, could I ask a question, please?
Yeah, thanks, Maria. Yeah, definitely.
I wanted to check. I've heard this anecdotally, and I don't know if there's anything behind it, but I was fortunate enough to be published in Business History earlier this year, and someone said that you should always wait a while before you try that journal again, because they try and make it more open for others. And I wondered if there's any truth in that, even or whether if I had another sort of follow-up paper to the one that was published, whether I should still go for business history, because that's the area that lends itself best to my research, and that was what I did my PhD in and so on. So it's really, I suppose that's really aimed at Stephanie. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks
Marie. Well, we don't really have a policy to not take something from somebody else for a while. But I guess we sometimes have situations where we have 2 or 3 manuscripts by the same author under review. And obviously, if there's more and more coming in, sometimes they also become very similar. And I think the main consideration, as you mentioned, a follow-up paper would always be, what are you adding to what you've already published? I mean, that's not just in business history. I had one of these reviews, and obviously I won't share names, but it was very amusing because as a piece of work, it was perhaps more in the management history field, but we put it through peer review because we felt it had wider relevance to the broader audience. And then the reviews came back, and basically one of the reviewers said they can send messages to us separately, said, I'm really concerned there might be some plagiarism going on here. It's very, very similar to another piece that was published in the Journal of Management History. And that was actually the author who had submitted to business history. So we ultimately decided to reject, partly on the basis of that review. There was another review that also highlighted issues, but because clearly that was an article that wasn't actually adding very much to the original piece published somewhere else in the field. So if it's within the same journal, obviously we look even more closely. Is this really something that adds, or is it something that replicates a lot of what was already in the earlier article? And I think if you're saying, you should give it some time, that might be more to do with the fact that historians traditionally haven't really co-authored very much. That's rapidly changing now. They may be working on one subject for a long period of time. And there's only so much new relevant within that journal space you can say in quick succession in different pieces. And, how do you cut the cloth? I think it's becoming very different where people have multiple sets of the co-authors and they might be submitting very different things, in which case we haven't got a problem with it. But the piece in and of itself needs to be novel and a substantive contribution. And shouldn't really significantly overlap with what's already there.
That's great. Thank you very much for that.
Okay, thanks, Mary, and thanks, Stephanie, for that. It's a coincidence, really, that Mary, you published your business history, and of course, Stephanie is here, so that's great. So your follow-up paper, Stephanie has told you that yes, there's a platform, so please get the follow-up written as quickly as possible. I think any other question, I can see Fida has a question. But any other question before anybody that wants to say anything before we start to look at the questions in the chat? Anybody that wants to add to the conversation as well? Or comments, it mustn't be questions. It could be just you sharing your own comments or experience. So it mustn't be questions, and it could be to anybody at all.
Can I take the opportunity, Christian, to appeal to your audience? Our biggest problem is getting reviewers. As Stephanie says, all of this is all not paid. And so you're always struggling for reviewers, not struggling, but there are, you know, the more reviewers that you can have on your books, the better. So if anybody would like, I keep speaking to academics who say, well, I would love to know, you know, to do reviews, but we're not necessarily aware of them. So if anybody would like to be part of the review process and would be available to do a review or two a year or whatever, just I would be very grateful. Just fire me an email and I will put you on a list of potential reviewers. So I've been being a bit of a chancellor there, just to...
No, but I think it's a big problem not having enough reviewers, and reviewers have to do an awful lot of work. I mean, it's that's just the reality, and we're getting more and more submissions, and I think for that reason also, desk rejection is something that becomes a much more common process, because we need to also manage the time and attention of our handling editors and of our reviewers. So all of these things, the do's and don'ts of publishing, become more important, because if you want to make it through those filters and actually get the attention and time and care from your colleagues, you know, it's necessary that you also signal from the get-go, you know, your piece is worth it.
Thanks, Stephanie, and thanks, Laura, for that. Of course, it's so important that people should review. I think the major thing is because many people don't get paid to review. Then, and we know as academics, we have a very high workload. So most people think, oh, it's useful, but you learn from the process. And most of the time, it's only when you review for that journal that you will know what they're looking for. And if there is something, okay, and I think it's FIDA. FIDA is asking, for early career researchers, any specific suggestions that you think will be useful for those that in their early career are just trying to write? Are there things that you think, how do you think they should go about it, publishing? So any of you that wants to start?
Is this the question about early career researchers, Christian?
Yeah, about early career researchers.
This is a kind of passion of mine, because I think it's fair to say that so I've been an academic for, God, ages, 25 years, right? And I think that the environment is more toxic than it ever has been before. I've had reviews that have been insulting, demotivational, really quite appallingly put together. I've had, you know, I won't use the words because you're recording the session, Christian, but yeah, so I've had some really appalling reviews. So for early career researchers, I think the first thing is grow a thick skin. That's the very first thing. You need to be thick-skinned if you're going to be an academic. You're going to get rejected. You should be rejected in a constructive way. And if you're not rejected in a constructive way, if people are rude to you, or personal, even though they don't know it's anonymous, but if they're making personal comment, this person's an idiot, then I would go back to the editor of that journal and say that you found the review inappropriate. Most reviews should be constructive, and most are, and the editor should be constructive. And again, in my experience, most are, but you do get people, reviewers, who use the anonymity of the review process to be unpleasant, frankly. Now, as an established and quite thick-skinned person anyway, in many ways, that's the sort of thing that sort of makes me sort of chuckle, right? Because it sort of speaks to the ego of the academic. But I also know of many particularly early career researchers, and also researchers from different cultural, gender backgrounds, who are really demotivated, destroyed by comments that are unnecessarily harsh. So my first piece of advice would be grow a thick skin, because you will be criticised. That's what we do. That's the job that we do. We criticise each other so that we can improve knowledge. That criticism should be constructive. Where it feels harsh, just take it as read that everybody's had this. It's not you, it's them. And keep doing it anyway, okay? You don't become a 4-star writer the day after you've passed your Viva. For many people, you build up you build up experience and expertise and skills. So practice and practice and take advice and put things out for review and have your peers read them and try and improve. And try not to be destroyed by what can be toxic, quite a toxic culture, and try and rise above it. Don't contribute to it either. So that would be my advice for early career research.
If I could add to what Laura is saying, I think the thick skin is that's a really good piece of advice. I think I once said to somebody, "Oh well, you know, I'm an academic. Of course, I'm used to rejection." And the person was trying to be really charming. It's like, "Oh no, of course not you." It's like, what are you talking about? This is completely unrealistic. And I've once been at an AOM event where a very established person said, "Oh, he's never been desk rejected in his entire career." And I mean, the hate in the room was palpable. And I was like, right, A, do we believe you? And B, even if it's true, did he need to say that? And then a colleague of mine just went, "It's a lie. I know it's a lie." So if people tell you that, they're lying. And it's also not something you should particularly aspire to. You obviously want to get the number of rejections you get over the course of your career to sort of taper off as you figure out what is happening. But that also means you need to be prepared at the beginning to deal with more of it. I think one strategy that's very good, and that's maybe more common again in management schools than what it used to be in history, but again, it's changing there as well. It's really to have a more experienced co-author who can help you steer through that process, who interprets it for you, who also knows at what point is it worthwhile saying something. I mean, most of the time when we have instances with sort of abusive comments, either to us as editors or to authors, we do not pass them on. Sometimes they can be quite harsh and authors may complain. We had a complaint recently where people inferred this was somebody who didn't like their work. It wasn't that person. It wasn't even a person from the same country. So, you know, there is a fine line between highlighting something that you need to highlight and just appearing petulant. And sometimes I think the best thing is to just move on. And it helps to have somebody more experienced writing with you to just sort of steer you through that experience. On the whole, I would really say, you know, the reviews you get, very often they're excellent. Sometimes I submit to these top journals simply to be rejected. And my aim is literally not to be desk rejected, to get a decent round of reviews, if with a lot of luck, maybe a major revision, but to get that sort of level of feedback that you get from some of these journals, you might have 5-6 pages of feedback. Even though we are rejected, I'll take that feedback, change everything in the manuscript, submit it to my second choice journal, because I normally have a list of journals that I'd want to submit to, and to simply use it either to test out, is this right fit for this journal? Yes, no. Are there really good comments here that will actually help me for the next journal that I know will be in a very similar intellectual space? So whenever you get comments for rejection, use them to revise the manuscript. Never submit the same manuscript if you get comments somewhere else. The fact that you got comments is almost as good as a review, and ultimately it'll make the manuscript better and more likely to be accepted somewhere else. But that is all assuming you understand the field you're joining and you're not submitting it next to a journal that has nothing to do with the first journal that you submitted it to. You know, even if you go from, say, entrepreneurship to organization studies, we've gotten comments in the past from entrepreneurship theory and practice that were very much in the organization studies space. So you still take those comments and think about how is it then relevant in an organization studies journal. But I mean, that's an extreme case where there's a piece at the intersection. They're always super difficult. Ideally, you want to stay within a certain domain, understand how these journals work together. And if you get rejected, that's like a round of review already done for the next journal.
Thanks, Stephanie. Thanks, Laura. I think the summary of what both of you have been saying is have a tough skin, because you're going to get rejected no matter what. And when you reject, you learn from the process. I think no matter how tough we are, we've always been rejected. I've been rejected so many times, more than the number of times I've ever gotten published. So I always expect rejections. And I think we need to be able to get used to the fact that we are going to be rejected. But take the feedback on board, like both of you have said, and try to see how you can take it in a nice way. I like what Laura said. Sometimes this could also be, they could be very, very harsh on you and say some very nasty words that we can't record at the moment, but still try to take the feedback on board. And of course, try to also respond to the editors, like Laura said as well. because sometimes they might also need to know that those people reviewing it are not doing the right thing. But beyond that, I think Shuai also wants to ask a question or say something.
Yeah.
Shuai.
Thank you. And I just have one simple question. I understand for journals, it's not easy to get enough reviewers or appropriate reviewers. So it may take a long time for author to wait the feedback. So if one journal takes more than 1 year to get round one review, as an author, do we need to withdraw our paper to try another journal, or just keep wait? Maybe round two may take another 1 year. Any suggestions?
I mean, I would say a year is long. I know there's certain fields where that happens as a standard. So working with economists, I think in a lot of their journals, waiting a year for a review is not unusual. So you need to understand what's expected within your field. I've had long waits of 7-8 months at some management journals, largely when there were guest editors in place. So often special issues I find can be slower. I guess the question of whether you want to withdraw or not depends on how keen are you on this specific journal or on this special issue. If you're keen, you wait. If you really think there are other journals I would also like to submit this to and I'm not happy with what's happening here, I would email the editor to sort of highlight it's been a very long time and you're concerned. And if then it becomes clear nothing is moving, I would, in your place, consider withdrawing.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you.
I agree with that, and I think that there is a genuine aspiration amongst editors to try to keep the process going. So it's definitely worth emailing the editor if it's been months and months and months, and they should look it up and tell you where it is or if it's got stuck somewhere or whatever. But I've been a victim of this as well, where papers disappear into an ether and you email the editor and you get no response. And I think if you've tried to approach an editor after months and you're not getting a response, then I think it's perfectly reasonable thing to withdraw your paper if they won't communicate with you and it's just disappeared into a black hole.
Okay, I see. Thank you so much for your advice. Yeah, it's very helpful.
Thanks very much, Shuai, and thanks Stephanie and Laura for that. I want to ask a question because that has always been in my head as well, and it's for Stephanie and of course Laura as well. Like, we always talk about predator journals, publishing predator journals. We see a lot of people, they reach out to you and you don't even know how they know your names, and they tell you, okay, yes, how they want you to publish there. So how can we avoid the risk of publishing in a predator journal? And how can we really evaluate a journal's quality so that we're not sending your work to a journal that you're not 100% sure is the right journal for you to send your work to?
Yeah, I think predator journals, in my previous position, I was at Aston Business School, as Associate Dean Research. What was an issue that the university was tackling, and I think particularly sort of in wider research management, there are big concerns. There is a list of predator journals that sort of you can still find on ResearchGate and other places. It's not really publicly available, but it does tend to be reshared. The person who originally compiled this, I think, had a number of legal threats and had to withdraw it. But there are clearly journals, and it's known within publishing, we discuss it with our publishers, that are predatory and that try to get you to submit, to commit, and then to actually pay for publishing the article. And that's a real problem. They do tend to be these journals that email you. I can tell you, we have a problem with getting everything through the journal and into issues. We have a lot of submissions. All good journals have a lot of submissions. They build reputation within their communities. So we are highly unlikely to start emailing people specifically to ask for submissions. So if somebody starts asking for submissions who you don't know, it's for a general journal that you've never heard of, and it's not a special issue, it's not something connected to a conference that you're familiar with, it's clearly a predatory journal, or very likely one. I mean, giving them the benefit of the doubt, but the likelihood is very high that they're predatory. Generally speaking, I found in business and management, the issue wasn't as big as in some of the other departments. Obviously, you get the nice spreadsheets and the overview of the institution, what's happening elsewhere. I think for us, it's easier because we have the CABS list. So the AJG is a ranking, yes, but it's also a certification if you think about it. So you don't get onto that list, whether you're 1-star or a 4-star, unless you're a reputable journal. There are over 200 journals on that list, so it's quite a diverse set of journals. Obviously, they're new journals. Some of them, I think, organization theory, everybody expects that it will come into the list very high, but it's a brand new journal. It's associated with a reputable conference. It has a sister journal. So you know that even though it's not on the list, you know who's associated with it. You see who's publishing in it. You know, do you know the editors? Do you know people who write for them? Are these reputable academics associated with universities where you may know other people? All of these things show you that they're in a network and they're reputable and they're working, you know, in the same way as the other journals. And this is really a straightforward way to avoid predatory journals.
Yeah, thanks very much, Stephanie, for that. I think for Laura, I'll just ask you a particular question before. I know we're running out of time. We just have 2 minutes left. But I know most times, of course, you're very involved in ISB and your friends a couple of days ago. And what do you think about putting a conference paper into a journal? Because most times people just want to put a conference paper and they just automatically, they feel it's going to become a journal paper. How do you think, what are the steps you think are required really to polish a conference paper before you can accept it as a journal article?
I think that it's quite a good process to go to a conference with a paper and get the feedback from that conference. Sometimes there's a formal written review process in the conference, so you've actually got a written review. Other times, as you give the presentation, you'll get suggestions and comments, hopefully again constructive, that'll make you have a think about the paper. But all the same rules still apply. You take your conference paper and you go and write it for the journal that you've targeted. So I mean, you can do it sort of slightly backwards. So for example, if you know that the Academy of Management is coming up, or you know that ISB is coming up, or whatever conference, the Rent conference is another one that's quite good for this. You can write a paper for the International Small Business Journal or the International Journal of Entrepreneurship and Innovation, present that style to conference, use the feedback, and then go and update the draft, improve the draft, sort of thing for submission. But yes, the same rules apply, is that you go to conference, get this constructive feedback. That's what conferences are for. But then write the paper for the journal.
Okay. Thanks very much, Laura, for that. I'm mindful of the fact that we don't have any time. Again, anybody that wants to ask any very pressing question or make a pressing comment before we go, because we're gonna finish early today because we have other engagements as well. So any particular question, anybody that wants to say anything? Okay, it's more like positive feedback. Everybody's saying thank you to Stephanie and Laura for your insights. I can see on the chat, a lot of people are saying they're going to contact you, Laura. They're going to become your reviewer. So please reach out to Laura. And of course, even Stephanie as well, because we all need reviewers. So please reach out to them. Well, thank you very much, everyone. Firstly, thanks Stephanie and Laura for attending. I know it's been at this time of the term, it's a very busy time for everyone, and I know how busy you guys are. So it's a privilege to have both of you, and we all found it very insightful. On behalf of the school and the dean that is not unfortunately here today, I'd like to tell you a big thank you, and hopefully at one point we'll be able to host you in Scotland physically. I know Laura is in Scotland, but Stephanie can get you from England to Scotland. And thanks everyone for attending. I believe we also found it very useful from the feedback that was obtained. These records will be available for those that were not able to make it. I think the major thing is, for me, we've been able to know more about publishing. We're able to know more about what the papers, what the journals are looking for. What do you think is important in your paper? Because most of the time, we just submit and we don't know why we are submitting, or we don't know why we are being rejected. But we have been able to get this insight from these two established editors-in-chief. And if we're able to follow it, of course, the sky can only be our limit. So thanks everyone for attending. And next 2 weeks, we're going to be having another research seminar where we'll be talking about developing the PhD, or the hidden insights about the PhD curriculum. So please watch this space. This is the beginning of many more research seminars to come. So please continue to engage with the seminar process. So if there are no questions, thank you everyone and have a nice day. Thank you and take care.
Thanks, Christian.
Thank you. Thank you,
Thank
everyone.
you. Lovely to
Bye-bye.
meet
Thank
you all.
Love you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.